Welcome to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. In this series, we dive into the role of Chief of Staff, exploring how it can be a game changer and pivotal player on your leadership team. You'll get a backstage pass and learn about the different aspects of the role and what it takes to excel in it. We'll hear from some incredible guests who have firsthand experience serving as Chief of Staff or collaborating with one on their team. And don't forget, the Chief of Staff isn't just a title or person, it represents a leadership philosophy. Leveraging Leadership is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. Ed, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Emily. How are you?
I'm doing well. So far, so good. The week is early yet, but we're off to a good start. I just want to thank you so much for being on the show. You're our first military Chief of Staff guest, so I think it'll be exciting for people to hear about your background and experience. So thank you for being on.
Well, thank you. I hope I can do it justice. So many people have done the job before. To have me come on and try to explain what a military Chief of Staff does is a little bit of pressure. But we'll see how it all comes out.
Being a Marine, I think you're going to rise to the occasion and do just fine. So we'll go into it. But you've just retired actually from a 30-year
I did
career in the Marines. And just going back to the beginning for a second, I think you were 17 when you went into ROTC, and that's how you got started. Is that right?
Yes. So that officially takes us back 34 years. But those 4 years at university don't officially count for active duty time. So some stint active duty, like the 6 weeks of officer candidate school, but I didn't actually start as an officer until May 16th. So my active duty time was 29 years, 6 months, and 15 days. We'll just round that to 30.
You know, to the day.
Years.
My goodness.
Well, the government knows to the day.
Fair enough. The government knows today. And then just out of curiosity, what had you interested in joining the Marines? Was it always the Marines, or was it the military in general? What? It
was always the military, but out of the services, the Marine Corps to me was the most interesting. My desire was to be a part of history, to see how the world actually works. I was a lover of history and cultures and geography. So I wanted to go see it. And that's what Marines do. Marines go and see the world as it actually is.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of it. My father was a Marine, but only for 3 years. So I never knew that. It was never a big part of my life. And like so many Marine fathers of that age, go in the military, go in the Air Force. And then they make some joke about golf clubs and or golf courses and officers clubs and stuff. But that's not what I want. I wanted to go into the Marine Corps and live the unusual life.
Okay. What traits make a good Marine? What do you think made you excel at being a Marine?
Well, you got to have self-confidence. You got to want to be held to a higher standard. You've got to want to be part of something different. You've got to be able to function as part of a team, and you got to love the people you're with. You're not going to succeed in the Marine Corps if you don't love the idea of what you're doing, if you don't love the values that it represents, and if you don't love the people that you're leading and working with. If you're just doing those people that are just doing it for the college money, we're not the service for them.
Yep. All right. So the Marines are elite. I know this because my first interaction with the Marine, my dad's work colleague was a retired Marine colonel, or I should say Marine colonel. You're never retired from the Marines. But he was in the Marines, and he was older by that point. But I had a fascination with military, and I loved the uniforms, and I liked learning about the ranks and who saluted who. And I would quiz him with, like, if a colonel and colonel meet, who salutes first, and all that kind of stuff. And he knew my love of the Marines, which I still don't know the answer to, by the way, so you might have to help me out later. But he knew my love of the Marines, and he took us to one of the rifle drill parades where they have a whole bunch of soldiers, and they're like flipping rifles in unison, and they're catching them without looking and doing different drills there. And I remember being just so how do they do that? How do they do that? And he was sitting right next
Mhm.
to me explaining, and this is an elite unit. You have to be 6'1", 6 foot to 6'1", and you have to train for hours and hours and hours. And those are real sharp bayonets they have on the ends of
Mhm.
their rifles. So I just remember that was my first kind of impression of Marines, like, oh my gosh, these are so exact and so precise and just so impressive.
Right. That's the silent drill platoon. And that's something that it is a showpiece deliberately to give exactly that reaction. Everyone who sees it, we give that image out there. Marine Corps, we hold very tightly to the legacy of the the respect in which, just like you described, so many people hold us, is due to the efforts of every Marine that came before us. And so we now have a legacy to uphold that, uphold that standard, that appearance, the way the uniform fits, the absence of facial hair while on active duty. So this is a new thing. All retirees essentially do it in the first couple of weeks. So we'll see if it stays. But it's a standard. It's the notion of Marines don't do that. So I was fortunate to be part of an exceptional group.
And then just so I know, when two colonels do meet, who does salute? Do they salute each other?
Nobody.
Oh, nobody
No.
salutes.
Same ranks. Same ranks don't salute.
Okay. Okay. This podcast is a win for me already. So now I've had
And
that.
and so that when you see it in the movies and stuff, Marines don't salute without covers. We call hats covers.
Yep.
So we don't salute without a cover, and we don't wear a cover indoors unless you're on duty or armed.
Oh, okay. These are good
Yeah.
ground rules to be aware of.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I know you speak Arabic, and I think you speak it conversationally now, but when you were in the Middle East, did you speak it fluently, or were you
Yes,
conversational?
I would say that. So one of the things that I was selected to do in the Marine Corps after about 6 years of service, I got selected to be a Marine Corps Foreign Area Officer. And at the time, that was a 3.5 year training pipeline. So the first year was to get my degree in Middle East Studies. The next year and a half was studying modern standard Arabic all day, every day at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, several hours of homework every night, which is mentally the most difficult thing I've ever done.
Mm.
And at the end of that, you can speak Arabic, or I could speak Arabic. Someone who doesn't know Arabic would say, wow, he's fluent. But once you've studied a language that long, the notion of fluency takes on a completely different meaning. But the last part of the program was to send me for a year to just travel the Middle East by myself, mostly, and learn what the reality was like. So I went straight from that to combat in Fallujah and in Ramadi in 2004 and 2005. And every day I was interacting with the Iraqis. So by the end of that time period, I was pretty fluent. If you would have met me in 2005, yes, I was very fluent. I could do meetings, I could shout down crowds, I could do things like that, do negotiations. But then I haven't used it
Sure.
all that much since then. So I was a naval attache for 3 years to the Sultan of Oman. But there, most people you needed to speak to spoke English. So
Right.
I only had to use it occasionally when you're outside of the capital. But all those experiences, all those different things, I think were pretty important in helping me to be the chief of staff that I believe I was.
Yeah. So before you became chief of staff, because I definitely want to get to that, but before that, what tour of duty or assignment would you say you learned the most from?
They were all so wildly different, Emily. That's a tough one, and I don't know that I can really answer because I learned huge amounts of different things at each one. The tours when I was going to Iraq from 2004 to 2008, I learned a lot about how the world works. I learned a lot about how do governments make decisions. Being an attaché, I got to see what was international diplomacy like. How does an embassy function?
Yeah.
How do ambassadors speak to each other when they're in a small group? How do governments actually interact when they're in those formal settings and informal settings? I had a time where for 3 years, I oversaw all intelligence and information systems for U.S. Special Operations Command. So it was a little north of $3 billion a year worth of stuff that I was dealing with. And I learned, well, how does acquisitions work? How does procurement happen? How does the the budget, what we call the POM, how does the budget actually work, and what's the cycle it's on? And then going to be the chief of staff at the recruit depot, I had to learn all about how do we actually recruit young people into the Marine Corps? How do we train them? How do we make sure the facilities all function? How does the system work? And it's amazingly complex.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Just before I forget, did you actually meet the Sultan of?
No, I got into the closest I got was taken, I think it was the commander of U.S. Central Command for a meeting to one of his palaces. So I got to the outer room, waiting room, inside, but only the principals went in.
Okay.
So my regular contacts were with the commander of the Omani Navy, their Coast Guard, folks like that.
But you were interacting with ambassadors, as you say, and I think visiting, like congressmen and senators and things to the region. Yes.
Certainly. Whenever they wanted to come in and say, well, what's the state of the relationship between the Omanis and the United States? Well, then you'd sit down knee to knee and you'd explain to them, this is what's really happening, and this is what's going on, and here's kind of how they see the world. So you can prep them for their interactions.
Okay. So then you become chief of staff, and there's so much to dig into here, but at a high level, can you just say, who your principal was, what your general scope of responsibility was in that role?
Sure. So when I got pulled into the role of chief of staff it was for Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, and the Western Recruiting Region. Now, what that means, we just call that MCRD. Okay. What that means is there's a one-star general, a brigadier general, that is the commander, the CEO. Okay. And that CEO then has a chief of staff. And that chief of staff in that role is a little unique because you also serve as the deputy commander. Whenever the commanding general is not present, is not able to respond to issues and concerns, you take the helm. And then you've got a broad staff beyond that. What we're responsible for is recruiting young people to be Marines, both enlisted and officers, from Okinawa, Japan in the west, all the way to the Mississippi River, plus Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin in the east.
Small territory.
So a small territory. So that's 51% of the U.S. population. So all the recruiters, all the infrastructure for those recruiters, we own all of that in the Western Recruiting Region. And then we will bring in about 18,000 young people a year from that territory. And then what we'll do is we'll bring them to San Diego. And once they get to San Diego, the Marine Corps boot camp, if you've ever flown into San Diego Airport, you'll see it shares a fence with the airport, which surprises a lot of people. But the main part of boot camp is their airport, where they'll do their 13 weeks of basic training. They'll do 4 weeks up we have a portion of our base at Camp Pendleton where we do field training in the rifle range. But we own those facilities. We own all the training responsibilities. And then we also are responsible for all the civilian workers, the chow halls, the facilities, the infrastructure, the security force, all the family support stuff. So all of those things come together. And as the chief of staff, then you are that link between the commanding general and everybody else on the staff. Now, I've seen in your podcast, you talk a lot about how the role of the chief of staff is a little unique and a little different. One of the things I point out with the military, or say with the Marine Corps, you're not going to be a chief of staff before you're a colonel. Okay. And you're not going to make colonel in the Marine Corps until you've had 23 years roughly
so it's tied
of
to tenure.
service as an officer. It's tied to tenure and then generally seniority on the staff. So to see a chief of staff that with less than 25 years would be, it can happen, but it's unusual because usually you're the most senior or tied for most senior officer on the staff. Okay. So it's a little bit different than you may see in the corporate world. But when I walked into the job, I had no experience in recruiting and I had no experience in training. Okay. I just been on a ton of staffs. I've been on a lot of very different staffs with different services. And so I had some idea of what right looked like. And so as the chief, you're not responsible for a whole lot directly. You don't own operations. You don't own
Surprise,
logistics.
surprise. Yes.
You don't own recruiting, but you're keeping an eye on all of it because the general is he can't. They can't be everywhere all at once. So to keep an eye on everything and figure out what were the priorities, where does the energy need to be placed in the system, what coordination needs to get done. That was really the key part of it all.
And it's so interesting because as I hear you describe that, yes, the apparatus is different, certainly in a military context, but there's so much that's the same as other chiefs of staff. For instance, you had a dual role. You proxy for your principal. You have to use your influence, not direct authority. You have to have a holistic view of the organization or the Marine unit you're in. So just to dig into a few of those things. So when you say the general was busy and I had to hold down the fort when he was away, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Well, what that means is in our particular case, because of the state of recruiting, the way it's been the last couple of years, it's been a challenge, and that takes up most of their time and attention. So our general's usually gone about 70% of the time.
Oh, wow.
Now, much of that time, they're in contact. You can reach them on the phone. They're reading their emails. Sometimes they're going to do video teleconference on the road. So I would differentiate. There's times when the general is not immediately available, which is going to be they're out all day with recruiters, so they're not going to be able to tend to things to the evening. So you make your decisions, you take actions on their behalf that are appropriate at the appropriate level that don't need to wait necessarily for them to be free that night. And then there's those things when, let's say, they are so bold as to take leave and go spend some time with their family, right?
Yeah.
So they go on vacation. General's not usually going to answer emails and phone calls and stuff. Yeah, when they're in Europe. So on those cases, you're going to step forward and you're going to take most actions. There are very, very few specific actions generally tied to legal things, court martials, stuff like that, that I would not act on because that's something that only the general can do. But most things you'd act just like they do. Gotcha.
And then did you know, so how do you become a chief of staff? Is that something you apply for like anything else? Is that something you get selected for? How does that work?
It's something that you get selected for. And they're looking for different things. A lot of times with the Marine Corps, a chief of staff is oftentimes, but not always, is oftentimes what we call a twilight tour. It's the last thing you're going to do before you retire. For some people, it's the last thing they do before they get selected for general officer and continue to serve. But it's one of those very senior billets, and the generals that are in charge have a decent amount of say in who is going to be their chief of staff. So they may reach out and say specifically, I want this person. That didn't happen in my case. I took over when I stepped into the job. The general that I was supporting, that I was working for, he took over on the exact same day.
Oh, wow.
So we replaced the chief of staff and the CEO on the same day. And we had never met before. Oh, but he was sent my bio. I'm sure he asked around to get some information on me and some references as to what was I like. And then we just took off running. And when we both got comfortable in the position, which took a few months probably, where we both were, where we could, read each other's meanings and communicate implicitly. When we got to that point, that's when really you can start doing more on behalf of your senior. You're more confident making the decisions because you know how they would make them.
Now,
and they trust you.
And had he had a chief of staff before, or was this his first?
He had for about 2 years.
Okay.
At his previous command.
So he was familiar with that role in general, and
yes.
And then he
certainly would have throughout his career would have worked with chiefs of staff
Okay.
in various staff positions. I don't believe he was ever a chief of staff, but then he had one working for him for the 2 years before he came to San Diego.
Okay. But he knew what to do with that role, because I have so many CEOs in business who think they want a chief of staff, who kind of maybe need a chief of staff, and they get one, and then they don't know how to utilize that role. So it sounds like he was very familiar with that role.
In the military context, you would know coming in.
Okay.
It's just a matter of what style of chief of staff is right for you.
Okay. How did you go about building a relationship, building up trusts, figuring out each other's work styles? You said it took a few months, which is similar to business, but how did you kind of, those first 90 days, how did you build that up with this brand new principal you had never met?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from for us, the end of day discussions or the discussions after a meeting. When you would both observe the same thing, and then everyone else would leave, and he may turn around and just say, "Hey, Ed, what was going on there?" And, I think he's looking for, did I see things different than he saw? Did I hear something different? Do I have more context? Am I able to say, "Hey, sir, this person was a little out of it today, but they're going through some stuff. I happen to know that their child something's happened, or there's something going on in their personal life." They can say, "I know they don't have full attention on this. They were nervous that they weren't prepared coming in. I already knew that. We'll get it fixed, and we'll get the report will come in later." Whatever it is, you've got to demonstrate over time that you're going to be frank, you're going to be honest, that you do know what's going on outside of what he's seeing, and that you've got a pulse of things on the stack. By the same token, from the other way around, it's, what does the boss have questions about? Where are their gaps? Where do they think they need the most assistance? How do they seem to understand things? How do they digest information? And then make sure that I take that information, and you've got to share it with everybody else and say, "Hey, you're presenting all this data to the boss, and it doesn't mean anything in the context you're putting it in. The data is good, but let's change the way we're going to present it. And the way we're going to present it is more streamlined. It's more visual, whatever it is." Or are they somebody who just loves spreadsheets and they want to go through and do the analysis themselves? I think those people exist somewhere. But it's over time. There's the little questions that happen and the little discussions that happen where if you never got deeply honest, if you didn't get introspective and have the guts to say, "Hey, sir, you said that thing in a meeting earlier today. I don't think it was received at all the way you meant it." And I could see some of the body language shifting in the chairs on the staff. I don't think people received that correctly. I think we might want to do a reattack, and maybe we describe it a different way. So you've got to be able to speak truth to power, or you're really of no value.
Hi, Emily here. I just wanted to take 10 seconds to highlight the power of one-on-one coaching at nextlevel.coach. Get the tools for success and leave each session feeling refreshed and refocused. And at what point were you able to do that? I mean, maybe day one, if something drastic happens, you have to say something, but is that something you build over time where you can have, "Sir, I don't think that landed how you wanted it to. We need to do it again"?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. There are those things that certainly, you got to call a spade when it comes. Hopefully you still have a position the next day. But over time, your ability of when do you need to do that, when is your advice needed and wanted, that becomes more and more clear.
You have described the chief of staff as the first among peers. So how do you see that role?
Well, I would say that when as I'm learning more about the corporate space and talking to friends that they're out in it, I see oftentimes, and I've heard you mention in some of your podcasts, chief of staff can be a stepping stone. That you go from a chief of staff position and you go on to be a CFO or a COO or something along those lines. In our context, you are going to be leading other colonels and lieutenant colonels
as a chief of staff.
and GS-15 civilians who are generally retired colonels. So you're going to have a bunch of people with the same amount of experience or similar amount of experience as you, but they've got a more specialized focus. They are the operations officer. They are the finance guy. They're the logistics gal, and they've got their area that they're running. Like for instance, in our organization, we would fluctuate in numbers based on the number of recruits we had. But at any time, we could get up to about 11,000 folks in the organization. And of those, we'd have 600 civilians. And then the rest would be Marines and sailors. But we had 11 colonels, to include myself, in that whole organization. 6 of them were commanders. Okay, so they owned a recruiting territory. They owned the responsibility for conducting boot camp, or they owned the responsibility for doing field training. And so they have their areas. Those commanders don't work for me.
Okay.
I don't really have influence over them unless I'm acting in the deputy commander role. But the role is, or the job is, to work as that interface between the two levels, right? And I would say the same, to a different degree, though, the same goes with those operations and logistics officers and stuff that have their roles. They don't directly have to work for me or through me, but they all use you as a sounding board. If you can build trust with them, the commanders will call you before they have a meeting with the CEO and say, hey, I got this thing I have to bring into the boss. Here's how I'm thinking I want to approach it. Is that going to work? And then you might say, I wouldn't phrase it that way.
Frame it up differently.
Frame it a little bit differently, because what you don't know is somebody else just came in and said X, Y, Z. Okay. Or you don't understand the context because this other thing has happened at an adjacent command, with our East Coast mirror unit out of Parris Island, South Carolina. They may have just had something happen that this commander doesn't know about.
Okay.
And so it's being able to say, hey, I think you're good, but I would just phrase it this way. And then, after there's a meeting, if there's relevant feedback from, say, the boss to me that I think the commander needs to know, I'm going to call the commander and I'm probably going to say, hey, just know here's what hit on target and here's what missed in what you briefed. If that wasn't clear, you give some kind of feedback so that they can improve their relationship and their interactions over time. And you do the same thing with the staff. So those colonels, over time, we built up trust with one another, and everybody comes in and they plop in the chair and they just start, well, hey, here's my issue, here's my concern. And you become the sounding board for all kinds of things. And through that, you're now able to act as that confidant to the commander, because you are tracking what is everybody's strengths and weaknesses, what are their challenges, what stuff are they going through outside of work, and then you, without betraying anybody's individual trust, you've got to know what do other people need to know in order to make the organization operate more effectively.
And how do you balance? So I ran into this as chief of staff, where people would come to me and they would use me as a soundboard, or they would actually be confiding in me in some cases. And I would have to say, okay, I want to build this relationship, but I also, part of my job is to pass relevant and helpful data points to my principal as well, but I didn't want to betray trust. So it was always kind of a balancing act of, okay, I have to do both of these things at once. How did you approach doing that?
I think it just comes down to, like I said, by the time you get into the position on the military side, as a colonel and a senior colonel, you've interacted with enough people to have a pretty good sense of, does my boss need to know this? Is this relevant? And a lot of times it's not. But if it helps put things into the proper light, particularly if it does so to the benefit or in the interest of the person who is going through something, that maybe explains why they were a little bit off and what things they're going through, then that's something that, the commander may hear, but it's nobody else needs to hear.
Sure. Yeah. And I would have another case where someone would be fired up about something. They would come to me and pound on the table and shout and scream and, drop curse words and all these different things and say, Emily, like, we have to do something. Why doesn't our CEO do something? We have to talk to him. And I said, okay, we have our meeting with him on Thursday. Let's kind of cool down a little bit, get ourselves situated, go in there, and I'll tee you up and you can explain the situation and then propose some solutions. And we get into that subsequent meeting and I tee it up and I turn it over and the person's like, nope, we're fine. I don't have a problem. I'm not causing problems. And so part of my job was to say, okay, after that person left, hey, CEO, here's the summary of the conversation I had earlier this week. And I think it's relevant and salient to you to know this is going on in this one organization. So to kind of be that conduit where if people did have a problem speaking truth to power and relevant information wasn't getting through, the chief of staff could help convey information that way as well.
Well, I would say in our context, you generally get to do that once. Where you get everybody fired up to get a meeting, you get the meeting with the boss, and then you say, no, nothing's wrong, everything's great. Oof. You don't get to do that again. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying you're not going to be fired, because you just can't do that very easily. But what I mean is you're going to go through more of a process the next time where I'll tell you, we can have the meeting, we'll get set up for the meeting, but we're going to sit down and speak before the real meeting. Okay, what are the slides? What are the products? What are we going to talk through? Just an informal, from principal to principal, and say, oh, okay, yeah, I think all of that is relevant and that's going to resonate. And that's where you're going to say, hey, we still have the meeting, but you don't need 45 minutes. We'll do it. You get 20. All right, let's be efficient about it. We don't need all this other background stuff, and just cut to the chase. So it's helping them to tailor their stuff. So that everything can get done a little bit faster, because there's too much stuff going on to get all of the background on it, particularly at the level of the CEO, the commander general.
So you mentioned you were in charge of operations, and in your world, the infrastructure you're talking about, we have like labor unions, religious support, legal, lots of direct and indirect things that are happening. Just running that infrastructure and those operations, can you just give us a handle on what that meant in your role? Because like many chiefs of staff, you had to have knowledge of various aspects of the business and be able to bring those things all together.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I would correct, because in this capacity, I was never the director of operations. We had a colonel that did that would run operations largely of recruit training. That was really the primary focus of it, and a lot of base events, because I maybe don't think about it all that much, but 42 weeks a year, we graduate Marines from boot camp. Okay. And so that means we're going to have anywhere from 1,000 to 3,200 family members showing up every week onto the installation, where you've got how are you going to search all the vehicles? How are you going to ensure, there's food, water, activities. There's, if anybody's going to throw around, they do it correctly, right? Any of those things. This
is family day, right? This is where people come.
This is family day and graduation. They're going to coordinate all of that stuff. Okay. What presentations are the families getting? How is it all going to go? And they're going to handle all those visitors. They're going to handle coordination for all of the congressional delegations and senators and everybody else that's going to come and visit and want to see, hey, what's going on with X, Y, and Z. So operations is going to do that. So what you end up with as the chief of staff, or at least in my experience, in my case, was like our provost marshal, who's our chief of police, reported directly to me. Okay, so we had as many as 130 military and federal law enforcement that are at the depot to provide security for the installation, right? And so I ended up working a lot with them as far as who would get access, who didn't get access. If a family member pops for a warrant as they're coming through the gate, do you still let them come to the graduation? How do you handle that? There are law enforcement incidents out in town that happen on the base. So you deal with that. But then I also would own a lot of the things that can get a commander in trouble. Okay, so I would say things like all of our family program stuff, they came in and report up through me. A lot of the safety, sexual assault prevention and response, domestic violence, because we've got 11,000 folks and they're spread out all over the country. So all of those things would come to me, and I would sit on the boards. I would be the chairperson for all the different committees that would handle those sensitive issues, because the commander themselves be present at all those things.
Sure.
But it's got to have a commander level of interest. So in our case, as the chief of staff, you ended up sitting in on all of those programs and making sure, are they operating properly, or is everybody being supported properly? And then getting into the analysis of the data that tells us, are we using these resources appropriately? If people say there's a demand for counselors, okay, we have a large number of social workers that are able to do family counseling and couples counseling and things like that. If people are saying we need more of them, well, okay, give me an analysis of how many clinical hours each of our people is able to provide each month and how many are being used. And if it's most of them are only executing 40% of their clinical hours, well, then who's not getting in? Who's being left without an appointment because we have the space? And so let's fix it if that's a problem. So you get a lot of really odd things that you deal with, and you throw in things like protocol, because you have so many visitors coming for formal events and local leaders that it seems mundane sometimes that who's sitting where and who gets to meet the general directly and who gets to.
Those are big deals, though. That's a big deal.
When they go wrong, it becomes an issue. So it's watching over some of that stuff, as well as giving guidance to the younger officers that are part of that. We would call it the inner circle of the command deck, the personal assistant, the aide de camp to the commander. The chief of staff for us has someone called a staff secretary.
Okay.
That works directly for the chief of staff, and they're going to be the one that is primarily focused on correspondence, policy, orders, the standard operating procedures, things like this. And so one of the roles they'll have is every single piece of correspondence or directive or letter that's going to go to the commanding general to be signed is going to go through the staff secretary first to make sure it's all correct. And then it has everything it's supposed to have, and then it comes to me. And I'm the final review before it then goes in to the boss. And is
that like a deputy chief of staff? Is that like an assistant? What type of function is that?
For us, we go down to the training companies, those young officers that are running Marines through boot camp, and you find a very cerebral, talented, well-spoken young captain who's generally going to be late 20s or early 30s. And they're going to get pulled up and they're going to be your right-hand person. And I was exceptionally blessed with a staff secretary that was a young guy, just brilliant. In between all the work he was doing for us, he was studying law to the point that he took the patent law exam and passed it. So he passed the bar for patent law. He's never been to law school. He's at law school now, but he was a brilliant guy. And that becomes kind of your right-hand person.
Yeah. And tell us, you had a great story about Family Day and how you had people actually walk through the experience of that. But just briefly, can you touch on that? Because I thought it was good.
Well, what I'd say is that there's it's a very predictable place, boot camp. It's kind of like Groundhog Day. Things happen again and again and again. They've always been that way, and this is how we do it, and it goes on for decades. And so as a group, it's easy to become nose blind to the things that are going on around you. And family day, you have thousands of eager family members that are out there interacting with their Marines, and they want to talk to people. If you're permanent personnel, sometimes that's kind of bothersome, because you're trying to get from point A to point B. You got a lot going on, and you don't want to doing something wrong, or they're going to fail to salute, or because they're nervous and they're not in a structured space anymore. So you end up stopping a lot, interacting with people, and some people at the time, it's just try to avoid that. So they wouldn't go out and walk around and see what was happening on family day. They just assumed it was going correctly. And it was, for the most part. But I would see little things that as I was walking around, because I would walk around and say, well, why are we doing X, or why aren't we doing Y? And you'd hear, well, this is the way we've always done it.
Danger.
We've done it like this for a decade or more, and nobody's complained. So why would we change it? So, all right.
Who's going to complain, though, in that situation?
Well, yeah.
Parents aren't going to be like, hey.
Parents are there to pick up their kid and take them home. And so they're not generally going to complain. So just decided that one day, I said, okay, everybody, we took all the deputies for the different units and the staff officers, and we said, okay, you're going to be present at 7:45 in front of the theater. You're going to be in civilian clothes. You can have one small bottle of water, and that's it. Beyond that, you have to get water where the families get water. You can only use the restrooms that the families can use. You're going to go to all the briefings, and we're just going to go through family day, and let's see what comes of it. When we got done with that, we came back together. It was amazing. Everybody's like, wow, that was terrible. Those briefs made no sense. I don't understand why you're doing that. I couldn't hear the speaker. So the sound was bad. The lighting was bad. Why did we move A to point B? That makes no sense. If I was a parent, I wouldn't have wanted to stand out here all that time. That's too long. So now everybody understood the problem. They all felt strongly about the problem, and they wanted to fix it, and they did. So the family day of the last 2 years, while thematically familiar to someone who had come long ago, is executed much differently. And I think it works a heck of a lot better. And that was because people got to develop the solution on their own. They understood the problem clearly, and they went after it in their lanes. Our communications guys were immediately, how do we fix the sound system in our theater? How do we get the lighting right? How do we fix this building? It all just worked out really quickly once everybody saw the issue. Having
them walk through the actual day as a parent. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that there's lots of gems of wisdom in there. One thing I want to touch on is a lot of times people hear like colonel, like military Marine colonel, and they instantly have this picture, or maybe it's a stereotype of someone in their head. And I just want to compare, kind of, talk about maybe a military leader in like the Vietnam era, or maybe back in the 60s, and then a military leader now. How, are those just generational differences? Is there fundamental differences? Have the branches of military done different things? Give us your insight on that.
Well, okay, and that's a broad one. I can only speak to my experience.
Sure.
When I was a young officer, when I first came in, colonels, a lot of them had been in Vietnam. They were still around. Okay, they were young officers or young enlisted Marines in Vietnam. And so they were still there. So I'll say, boy, they sure looked a lot older than colonels do today. Because they don't have the youthful exuberance, certainly that I have. But I think there might have been some generational differences, more than there were service differences. Things have changed. My generation was shaped by 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
And, young Marines today are every bit as capable as the Marines who came before, every bit as tough, but they're just different. They communicate differently. You know, the way you remember things, oftentimes you have to pause and say, is that how it really happened, or is it just how I remember it? But I remember when I was younger, colonels, particularly chiefs of staff, were very dour, old, angry guys, usually. And now there's still some of those out there, but they're all different shapes and sizes. I generally judged success by, were people joking around? Were people laughing? Were there smiles on the staff? Who's staying late? That's not a sign of success. That's a sign of inefficiency.
Mm.
So the stereotype that people have, a lot of times it's based on Jack Nicholson and in A Few Good Men.
You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a little hard to get away from. So, you know, people see that. And that's one of the things I'll tell you that I experience now as I'm actively in the job search realm, is that people have a stereotype of what they think a Marine colonel is. And God bless them for it. They respect us and they think very highly of us. But unless they served in the military in the 20 years, they probably don't actually know what a colonel is like. And I would say that we're all different.
Of course.
There's some common traits in there. But people tend to think of a very wooden, authoritarian, very stern person who doesn't smile a lot. And that's just not the case.
I think that's accurate, though. That's people's perception. And then I asked that question because as I was talking to you, I mean, certainly you can tell you were in the Marines for 30 years. You have a military bearing, but you're energetic and driven and compassionate and empathetic, and you're all these different things where it's like, the stereotype on this is not matching, which I think is a good thing. So
yeah, we're remarkably lifelike.
Yeah. It's like you're real people. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So,
so you do see a lot of that, and you've just got to use those same skills that I think you use out in the corporate world. You know, you can't shout at people much. Right. I don't know that I ever did as the chief of staff, because you shouldn't have to. And so, you know, it is very different. And, you know, as a military chief of staff, I'm dealing with employees' unions. I'm dealing with finance and payroll, and how do we manage to deal with facilities and infrastructure, and going out to meet with all the local leadership at receptions in the evening to press the flesh and get the message out there. It's speaking to teachers to get them to understand what the military is and isn't.
Yeah.
So that they can encourage their students. So it's a lot of different things that are present in the corporate world. They're present in different businesses. It's the same facets. But what you typically, or what I get a lot of, is people say, you've had a fascinating career, done some amazing things, but you don't really have any experience in what we do. So we don't have a job for it. And you're like, well, let's have a talk. And you may find out that I've
so many
a lot
intangibles
more.
Though that you bring.
Yeah.
I would question that. Yeah. So many X factor. Okay. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned you can't yell at people, because the Marine colonel I was referring to at the beginning of the call, I would say, did you bark orders at people? Did you yell at people a lot? Were you in charge? And he was like, you actually don't want to yell at someone. The only times you want to yell, he said, was when you're chasing a woman to give her purse back, or when you're preventing someone from getting run over in the street. And so he was kind of older school, but he was like, you got to be, doing something nice and giving something back to someone, or saving their life in those situations. So it was funny that you mentioned that. But I know we're coming up on time, and you've been so generous to round us out. I just wanted to pull up my copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, because, I know you're a fan. Here we go. Oh my goodness. There we go. And I have so many gems from this book, and I try to read it a couple different times, but there's just so much good stuff in here. I knew that you were a fan.
And that's The thing you had asked me earlier or before we had spoken a little bit about what books instead of read for inspiration on leadership. And I tend to go more towards those, okay, towards meditations, towards Thucydides and Peloponnesian Wars and some of the classical philosophers. And that's because none of the stuff we're facing is new.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get that through your mind, that it's not put the emergency in context and put the stuff that's happening and the chaos in context and realize this has been dealt with before. People have gone through these same events. How do we get ourselves through it? Okay. And so just take a breath and let's figure this out. And so that's just where I've gotten it. And I think as far as, leadership inspiration, it's just it's been watching the people around me over the last 30 years of all ranks and discovering, I like the way she does that. I like the way he does that. I don't like this. I don't care for that person's briefing style at all. And you figure this stuff out. And so I feel you get to a pretty good spot of confidence as far as your leadership style by this point.
Yeah, I love that you love Marcus Aurelius. And I think along with the greater Stoic philosophy, it's, what is in your control and what is not, and making the distinction between the two, and then placing your focus on the things that you can control as well. So with that, we'll end with Marcus Aurelius. I've never done that in a podcast, but winning. There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being generous with your time and information. And I know I've learned a lot from this conversation with you. And I will pass along my thanks from the listeners as well. So thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be with you. All the best to you. Take care.
If you'd like some more information on the topic discussed in this episode, head over to nextlevel.coach and click on the resources page for some helpful free downloads.